Space absolutely blows my mind. If I could take the sense of awe and inspiration that I feel on a really clear night under the stars and beam it to the rest of the world, it would start world peace. In my mind, the way the fantasy goes is like this. I'd be under the night sky, I'd start getting the goosebumps on my arms, and then across the world, armies that were engaged in warfare would start looking at their weapons and they'd be like, what am I doing? And just throw them on the ground. And Parliament would come into session the next day and governments would say, we need to stop burning fossil fuels and invest in green technology. And fleets that were out in the ocean would say, we got to start killing whales. And people would reach out to the poor and the homeless, and it would totally change the world. Well, how would that be? Because space seems often really distant and far away and irrelevant to us. I could tell you that last week there was a supernova in a distant galaxy, and you would say, that's great, but I have mortgage payments to make and kids to raise. And sometimes the language also escapes us in terms of describing space. So many of the conversations that I have with people will start off with me saying something like, did you know that the Earth could fit in the sun 1,000,000 times, but then degenerate into lots of hand motions and sound effects? And so you can imagine what my social life was like growing up. So a better way to think of space, and this is the way that also not only makes it easier to describe, but also the thing that inspires me about it, is to think of it not as something that's just full of gas and planets and stars and all, Chris Hadfield and all these really abstract things, but also as something that's a giant story. It's a storybook. It's one that we are a part of. It's a story that tells us about our own lives. It's a story that tells you about your life. It's a story that tells you about our inheritance in this planet and our common heritage in our past. Now, thinking of space in that way is actually not unusual, because for thousands of years, before we knew that space was full of stars, it was actually full of stories. Stories of constellations and of legends and myths and gods. We also tell those stories now with contemporary science fiction. And those stories have had a real impact in my life and the way that I relate to other people. It's changed the way that I think about exploration. It's inspired me to explore. It's changed the way that I think about objects of value, like a diamond, for example. It's changed the way that I also think about tragedies overseas, like one that I observed in Africa. And it changes the way that I think about my own sense of identity, which essentially is a question of belonging. Because if we are all part of one giant story of life, how does that change the way that we relate to each other, the way that we connect to each other? And when you put that on a global scale, well, that really becomes the most profound question there is, which is, are we the only people asking that question? Is there life somewhere out there in the universe that's asking questions like we are, that also is creating art and is fighting wars and has created technology and civilizations and thinks about the same things that we think about? Because ultimately, out of everything that we could possibly find in space, life would be the thing that would be the most life-changing. If you were to find Spock and he were to land in your backyard and say, live long and prosper, well, that would really change your day. It would also really change your backyard, right? And that's where I come into the story. Not because I'm an alien, although that has been debated by some people who know me, but because when I was a child, all I wanted to do was fly and find aliens and be a part of that grand story of life. I used to have this toy when I was a kid. It was a gun, and it had a big satellite dish on it with headphones, and you could point it at people and hear what they were saying for far away. It's a toy that no child should be allowed to have, right? But what I would do instead is I would point it towards the sky because I wanted to find aliens with it. And it turns out that there are people in their adult lives who do this for a living. So clearly I have missed my calling. The other things is that I can remember some of my earliest memories are all about space. I loved Star Trek when I was a kid, and one of my earliest memories is actually smashing a glass coffee table in my parents' house with a die-cast model of the USS Enterprise, as it would be like flying past the screen in the opening credits of the show, got out of my hand, and flew through this table. But shows like that they were the ones that inspired me to think about exploration and doing good. I figured, well, if I could be a captain of a ship and fly through the universe and do good, then I was probably doing pretty good myself. My grandfather was also a huge inspiration in my interest in space. He had this little rickety 60mm telescope. It was hard to point at things correctly. But I remember on clear nights at a cabin in Shabandwan Lake in northwestern Ontario, we would set that up and we would gaze at the stars at nighttime. The first thing I remember clearly seeing through that telescope was the planet Jupiter. What normally is just a bright point in the sky, very distant and far away, suddenly became a whole other world that I was able to see. The light from that was coming through this little scope and reaching my eye, and I was totally blown away by that. You could see the bands and stripes on it. You could see the planets. Another time we were out, my grandfather pointed really late into the night sky into a fuzzy little patch. And he said, "You see that cloud over there?" He said, "That's not a cloud. It's actually a whole other galaxy, a giant collection of stars that's outside of our own. If you could zoom into it, it would look something like this." And I remember when he would tell me things like that, he would emphasize the fact that he was using numbers not like millions, but billions. And he would say, "Billions with a B." And then he would stare at you and say, Make sure that you understood. And of course, I was this tall, so I didn't necessarily understand. All I knew is that this man that I respected found this really important. And this is a man who had lived through a war. He was a POW in the Second World War, and so I was going to listen to what he told me. Well, with all of that inspiration in my life, what was I going to go and do? Well, clearly, I was going to become an astronaut. And that was the plan all the way up until high school, when I found out that A, I suck at math, and B, my eyes are no good. Ironically, probably from squinting at stars and watching lots of television. So I defined another life path. And following the footnotes in my own life, I said, well, again, life should be about exploring and it's about doing good. If I can't do that in space, and I'm no good at math, then maybe I can do it in an arts program. And that's where I found myself here at the International Development Studies program at the University of Toronto. And subsequently at a one-year placement in a country called Sierra Leone in West Africa. Now, if that seems kind of like a jump in the story, you can imagine how I felt, because I was living that jump in the story. Like, I didn't belong in Africa. I didn't know anything about warfare. This was a post-conflict country. I never fought in wars. I never experienced wars, except for ones that I'd fought on the internet. Right? And this was way beyond my experiences. Now, the conflict in Sierra Leone was created by and catalyzed by diamonds. Diamonds are rare to us because they're hard to find, and they're created under very specific conditions. Temperatures and pressures within the earth force elements together, they harden and crystallize, and over billions, with a B, years, they will come up to the surface of the planet where they're found in mines like this. This is an alluvial diamond mine in Sierra Leone. Diamonds are found just when the rainwater washes soil away on the ground. And unfortunately, a lot of those diamonds are mined by children. And they're smuggled out of Sierra Leone. They'll find them ways to the wrists and fingers and necks and ears of people all over the world, not realizing that in purchasing them, we were fueling a war in another part of the world. The chaos that was wrought on this country was absolutely unbelievable. There was a time when the nation had reached out toward the country and had told the citizens, the future of this nation is in your hands. And a group called the Rebel United Front that was trying to break down that symbolism of unity in the country started cutting off people's arms. In the midst of all of that chaos, there were community leaders, though, that came forward to try to make a difference. And one of them was a woman I met named Esther. Esther was an impoverished woman herself, but through a series of community gardens with 8 other women, she managed to raise enough money to rent a school building and start her own school. Her goal was to take any one of the children that had been affected in the war that she could, especially young women, and take them into her school, especially considering that most of the schools in the country had been totally destroyed by the Civil War. Regardless of what their background is, what they had done, if they had fought in the conflict, whether or not they had been considered sex slaves or they had engaged in prostitution, she didn't care. She wanted to bring them in. What she was trying to do was instill in them a sense of value, because they had been literally told that their lives were worth less than a stone that was in the ground. When I got back from Africa, I now was at this divergence in my own life. I didn't know how to process what I had experienced over there. And it was also very clear that Esther didn't need my help to be making differences in the world. I really needed hers. But all of this childhood interest in space now seems so out of place. It had started to seem really childish. Until a couple years went by, and I read a really fascinating article that a friend sent me. Truthfully, it was probably found on Google, let's be honest. But it was about a planet called Jupiter, the same planet that I had seen through the telescope with my grandfather. Now, Jupiter is called a gas giant, so aptly called because it is a giant ball of gas. It's got stripes and spots, and it's essentially a cloud with a sense of style. But in the clouds of this planet, Jupiter, it actually has the correct conditions to rain diamonds. It actually rains diamonds on planets like Jupiter. In fact, some of the other gas giants in our solar system also have rain of diamonds. I started thinking to myself, I said, what would Esther think if she knew that the thing that fueled a war in her nation was as common as rain on another world? And in fact, when we look out into space, we realize that many things like diamonds are not as rare as we think they are at all. The largest diamond that we've seen in the universe is as large as the entire Earth. It's called Lucy, after the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It's like trillions of carats large. But what is the one thing that we are looking for in the universe that is actually rare? And right now, we have something called the Kepler mission that has just recently ended, and it's a search for other types of planets. Planets like the Earth, gas giants like Jupiter. And specifically, we are looking for one thing in those planets. We found a lot of really interesting ones. Planets that are purple, planets that are black, planets that are gas giants like Jupiter, planets that are completely made of water, planets that have 3 suns in the sky if you were standing looking on them. But the one thing we're really interested in is that which we've always been looking for in space, which is life like ours. How do we find it? Well, we look for planets that are in something called the Goldilocks zone. If you know the story of Goldilocks, it's porridge that she was looking for that's not too hot or not too cold, but just right. And there's a band of space around a star, just like there is around ours, which our planet happens to be in, where the planet itself is not too close to the star to be hot, or not too far away to be cold, but is just right. And it turns out that when we look into space, it is the minority of planets in space that are actually in that zone, which means that it is possible that life, as we know it, especially walking, talking, breathing, culture-creating, civilization-making, technology-creating life, is perhaps one of the rarest things in the entire universe. It's certainly a lot rarer than the things that we've been trading it for on this planet. But what are we doing with life on our own planet? We crush it, we consume it, we're poisoning it. We've also become really, really adept at dividing it. Now, this image of Earth is not as rare as it used to be one day. Now that we have humans living in space, we see pictures like this all the time. Things that are really remarkable about this photo is not what you see, but it's what you do not see. And what is it that you don't see? Borderlines, colored countries, labeled countries. And people have told me, they said, you know, if you're going to go into the TED Talk with a no borders concept on the Earth, it might seem a bit naive. People may not buy into that. And I said, wrong. It's naive to think that those borderlines existed to begin with, because they're not really there. They're totally imaginary. The things that we think of, the countries that we've created, are totally imaginary. And when we think of the people who have been the greatest world changers in our history, they're not necessarily people who broke down boundaries. They were people who reminded us that they didn't exist to begin with. Rosa Parks, when she's on a bus in the middle of the American Civil Rights Movement, who says, I don't see the line on the bus. Nelson Mandela in post-apartheid South Africa, who said, there are no lines and divisions between these people. Esther, overseas in Africa in her school, said, regardless of where your clan, or what your clan history is or what you've done, you can come to my school. Astronauts in orbit circling the Earth say, you don't see the lines. It's easier to call each other aliens when we lived 20 miles apart from each other in different caves, and it took days to get there. But the Earth doesn't look like that anymore. The Earth looks like this, and it looks like this. This is an image of Earth taken from the Apollo astronauts on the way to the moon. They reveled at the fact that they could reach up and cover the planet with one finger. All of what we knew about human history and civilization was under one person's thumb. The Earth also looks like this. This is an image of the planet from Saturn. It starts to dwindle away to a tiny little dot. And finally, the Earth also looks like this. This is the farthest image ever taken of the Earth before. Carl Sagan, the astronomer, called it the pale blue dot. And from this distance, and I use the term astronomically in those literal way, our differences become astronomically tiny, and our similarities become astronomically large. We are all humans living on a tiny blue dot in the middle of the cosmos, floating beside a giant white arrow in space. So what happened in Africa? We forgot this. We lose perspective because we're used to looking at life this close all the time. And when you step back, you realize that when we lose that perspective, we go totally insane. We're willing to trade what's more valuable from a cosmic perspective for something like stones in the ground. This, when I mentioned earlier that space tells us a story, this is the story of our common inheritance. This is what we own together, this tiny little patch of space. But I also said that we have a common heritage as well. And I'm not saying that all of your background, your history, the country you hail from, where your family's from, doesn't matter. But in addition to that, we have a history that goes much, much farther back. And it actually starts in the stars themselves. Stars, like our sun, are element factories. They take elements together, like hydrogen, and like Lego blocks, build them together into the calcium that's in your teeth, the iron that's in your blood, the steel and the chairs that you're sitting in right now, the stuff that the school's made out of, the crust of the earth that we're all standing on right now, all came from the heart of a star under specific temperatures and conditions over billions with a year, or billions with a B, years until they came to the surface. Does that sound like a familiar story? Doesn't that sound like the formation of a diamond in Sierra Leone? We are the diamond. Life on this planet is a diamond. The planet itself is a diamond. And like any diamond, when you pull it out of the ground, it doesn't look like the one that you set in a ring. It takes time to cut, to polish. And just like us in our own civilization, we need some polishing and cutting too before we can be set in our proper place in the universe. And when all of those heavy elements have finally sunk down to the middle of the star, it blows itself to pieces and it sends them all out into the universe. And over billions of years, they spin together and they form TEDx talks, and they form the city of Toronto, and they form little kids who want to sit down and watch Star Trek when they're growing up. This is an image of an actual supernova, the event, the energetic event that sprayed all of the matter into the universe, or some of the matter of the universe that we're made of. And there are a few things that I can think of that are as inspiring as to know that the beginnings of life, of our lives, started as one of the most brilliant and energetic events in the universe, a bright flash in the midst of a cosmic darkness. Doesn't that change your sense of belonging and your sense of identity? And isn't that what we're all really looking for, is that sense of belonging and connectedness to one another? Well, we have one. It starts at the very beginning of our existence. And I think it's really common to all of us is to look for that, regardless of what we look like, what we believe, what ideas we hail from, is that we're all valued. Because that's really where connectedness comes from, and a sense of belonging is from value. And we're really all looking for that. I know for a fact because I go to science fiction conventions. Right? I had the pleasure once of interviewing Star Trek actor Will Wheaton for a documentary film that we're doing. And he said something really profound. We asked him a question. It's the same one we asked of all of our interviewees in the documentary film. And it was, why is space so alluring? And most people would talk about the fact that it's really big and it's got these really neat things in it and we want to go out there and find them. But he said, space is alluring because it's a place you wanted to go to as a kid when you felt like you didn't fit in on Earth. Like you felt like something was wrong with the planet. Why do I think that sense of awe and inspiration can change the world? Because I think in a sense, we would do better off to remember those times when we're kids, inspired by something to explore, to not be afraid of difference, to want to reach out and connect with one another, and to be keenly aware when something is wrong with the world. So what am I saying? That we all need to become astronauts and astrophysicists to care about the world? No. What I'm saying is that the very essence of the value of life in our lives is challenged on a day-to-day basis. Because you might be a woman living in West Africa, and you've had Rebel United Front carved into your chest and told that you're property and that you're less than rocks in the ground. Or you might be a person living in Toronto in the day-to-day daily grind, and someone's cut you off for the third time in the highway, and you actually start hating people. Or that guy in the subway has decided that his bag deserves a seat more than everyone standing else around you. That is why, because we live with life so close that we forget about just how truly value from a cosmic perspective it really is. So what I'm offering as that symbol that's common to all of us is the night sky, one that's above us all, that has reminded us of our common history, that hopefully inspires a united future, It is a place that we've poured our inspiration and our imagination into for thousands of years, and has become kind of cool to talk about again, which I really wish had happened back in the 80s. It's space. Can we make those changes happen to the world? I think so. If we really want to change the world, I think we need to see the world for what it is. And it's a world that truly, when seen from space, has no borders. There's a woman in Africa who helps make those changes happen. I think we can too. Our legacy is that we are literally children made from the stars. So go and burn as brightly as you can. Thank you very much.